Okay, folks, welcome. Delighted to have everybody here. I know almost everybody that I see in the audience, but for those of you who might be new, my name is Paul Herbert. I'm the director of the First Division Museum at Cantigny. Welcome to Cantigny. We're delighted to have you here today. For those of you who don't know, this is the historic home of the late Colonel Robert R. McCormick, a longtime owner, publisher, and editor of the Chicago Tribune. He became a very, very wealthy man and lived here on this estate and passed away here in 1955. And not having children, he said, "Leave my estate as a park for the people of Illinois." Those of you who came down from Wisconsin are also welcome. And he left all of his wealth to our parent organization, the Robert R. McCormick Foundation in Chicago, which is a major philanthropy. We're called Cantigny because we're named after a tiny village in France, about 75 miles north of Paris, where the 1st Division of the United States Army fought America's first battle for Europe from May 28th to 31st, 1918. And Colonel McCormick was there. He commanded the 1st Battalion, 5th Field Artillery of the 1st Division. He was devoted to the division and veterans and soldiers and our Army for the rest of his life. He called himself the Colonel for the rest of his life. And so this place is named after a battle. And it's very fitting that his first Board of Trustees decided to put a museum on the park that he left for the people of Illinois to his beloved 1st Division. And it's fortuitous for us because that outfit became the 1st Infantry Division, the famous Big Red 1. It is the first and oldest combat unit in the United States Army. It is coming up on 100 years of service. There's not a day has gone by since the 26th of June, 1917, that the men and women of the 1st Infantry Division have not been serving us, and today some 3,500 of them serve in Afghanistan. So it is in the mission of the 1st Division Museum that we have this series of talks by distinguished speakers from all over the country on various dimensions of American military affairs. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I do have 2 administrative announcements, and so we're going to have to fool with the slides here for just a second, but let's go to the second one. The next in this series is this. We usually have these on the first Wednesday of every month, but every once in a while we're off that cycle. So the next one we'll do is on Thursday, October 24th, and Pete Manser, who is head of the Center for National Security Studies at The Ohio State University, retired Army colonel who served as aide to General David Petraeus while he was commanding our forces in Iraq. We'll be discussing his newly released book, Surge, My Journey with General Petraeus and the Remaking of the Iraq War. So I encourage you to be back on Thursday, October 24th. Next slide. And we do these free in the interests of the public, but I certainly encourage any of you who may have a couple of spare quarters in your pocket on your way out to stop by the Veterans Welcome Center, and there's a red, white, and blue mailbox there. We will gladly accept any change that you might have, and we will see that it goes to this wonderful institution, grassroots nonprofit organization founded by our good friend and veteran of the Vietnam War, Bob Adams, the Midwest Shelter for Homeless Veterans. The state of Illinois has several, we believe, among the homeless population in the United States, of the state of Illinois, there are several thousand honorably discharged veterans who have no place to call home, and Bob does a wonderful job trying to address that problem. If you don't know about the institution, you probably should. There's some literature out there, but your donations tonight will go straight to the Midwest Shelter for Homeless Veterans. So those are my administrative announcements. Back to the first slide, please, if we can do that. So it's my great pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, Donna McAleer. Donna is going to talk about her recent book, Porcelain on Steel, Women of West Point's Long Gray Line. I think most of you know that women were not admitted to the military academies until 1976. The first class that included women was in 19 80. She'll tell us much more about that, but she's written a book on women's experience at West Point and in their service in the Army following their graduation. Donna speaks on many, many topics around the country, particularly on leadership, team building, role models, boundary breaking. Her book has won a couple of awards. She has studied and practiced leadership for more than 20 years. She is a West Point graduate herself, class of 1987. She served her military obligation as an officer in the Military Police Corps and then branch transferred to the Corps of Engineers. She has been a corporate vice president, executive director of a nonprofit, the People's Health Clinic. She pursued a lifelong dream of making the United States Olympic women's bobsled team and performed in the 2002 Winter Olympic Games and has dedicated her time to service in her community. She served on 3 alumni boards at West Point. She was a founding member of Journeys Within Our Communities. She is a long list of acronyms that, because I'm not an accomplished skier, I don't understand, but she's a certified ski instructor at Deer Valley Ski Resort in Park City, Utah, near her home, and she has served on the board of directors of the Professional Ski Instructors of America, the Intermountain Division. So a long list of accomplishments here that have got to touch some interest of almost every person in our audience. Last year, she was the Democratic nominee to be the representative from Utah's 1st Congressional District, and she was appointed last year also by Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta to the Defense Advisory Council on Women in the Service. She still serves on that council and just recently was in Washington to advise Secretary of Defense Hagel on that very important issue. So it is a great pleasure to have her here at Cantini, and please join me in welcoming Donna McAleer.
Thank you all for making the time to be here tonight. Many of you know of Dr. Herbert's incredible operational and academic record and his writing achievements and accolades, but what you may not know about this 1972 West Point graduate, he was known as Herbie to his classmates. Rich, can you bring up a slide for me, please? So, this is Dr. Paul Herbert as a cadet, class of 72, as I said, and I'd just like to read you what his classmates wrote about him, because I think it says a tremendous amount, and it's a great example of really good writing is really simple. Herbie is a friendly and outgoing person who can never pass up a chance to discuss anything from philosophy to personal problems. His concerns for people and his optimistic view of the future will no doubt ensure his success as an officer. I think that's one of the nicest accolades I've ever heard or seen in a West Point howitzer. So thanks, Rich. I really appreciate it. And I think we should also notice he did update his glasses there. They're much more contemporary now. So it was here at Cantini. Those were, well, we called those, we had a couple of acronyms I think many of you might remember. TEDS was one name, Tactical Eye Devices. By the time women came aboard, it was called BCDs, Birth Control Devices. So, yeah, those are pretty classic. I think they might be coming back in style, so maybe he still has them. So it's actually here at Cantini. I wanted to let you know that I actually got my start playing golf. Several years ago, the former director of the Robert R. McCormick Foundation, General Dick Barenhausen, and I served on a board together. And he hosted the board meeting here. And the second afternoon of the second day, everybody was treated to a round of golf, and I was the only person who didn't play golf. So I spent kind of those 9 holes in the 18th hole having a few beverages and certainly vowed to learn to play. And so it's a great privilege to be back here and have always wanted to come here and certainly never expected to be here in the capacity of an author. And when you look at Colonel McCormick's history as a journalist and founder of the Tribune. It kind of gives me chills, so thank you for having me here. I believe we have several veterans in our audience tonight. Do we have any veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan here? JD? How about of World War I, II, Korea, Vietnam? Korea? Well, thank you all for your service. It's because of you that I and others were able to continue to serve, so thank you. How about any teachers? Do we have any primary or secondary, high school or college teachers here? 1, 2, okay, great. Oh, that's right, you told me you were getting ready to go back and do some teaching in 8th grade. So this is a book about strong women role models. I will share with you, I'm a little bit technology challenged. I think technology has been great, yet I now bring a laptop, an iPad, a hard copy as a backup device, and I kind of tend to try to go through 3 of them. So, Rich, can you just switch the slides over back to mine? Thank you. Okay, we'll kind of go, let me go backwards here a little. Okay, so I kind of like to share, often when I speak about my book, there are several questions that are traditionally asked. You know, why this book? What was the genesis? How was the writing process? Tell me about getting published and a little bit about the history. So I'll share all that, and I'll share some of the stories of the women profiled in here, and then I'd just like to open it up for questions and fire away. So this is a picture of West Point, an aerial view actually taken by Lee Ross in his plane. He's an aerial photographer who's a friend of mine. And I think it demonstrates really the strategic significance of West Point as a promontory. Recognizing the achievements of women in all facets of life, in the military, in government, in business, in medicine, in art, in sports, has enormous impact on the development and self-respect and the understanding of new opportunities for girls and young women. The past shapes and forms us. At times, it even entertains us. It provides us a source of power and fuel for our dreams, and I believe by understanding those glories and iniquities of American history, it helps us understand who we are. Role models renew our sense of optimism and increase our confidence in our own abilities to succeed. They set examples for all of us, our daughters and our sons. And we draw strength and inspiration, at least I do, from those who came before us and those remarkable women among us today. They are part of our story. And I think this is nowhere more true than on the banks of the Hudson River here at West Point, because West Point is a place where bridges to the future are built from a location where the past is always present. And if we look through some of the iconic scenes of West Point here, this is now looking south at the plain and our cadet barracks area. I just want to kind of share some of the walk through history. If you go to West Point, it is really walking through American history. This is a statue of General George C. Patton, and this is actually a historical picture because that statue was moved under great consternation several years ago. And in the background is General Douglas MacArthur. This is Battle Monument. There's 2,233 names on Battle Monument. General George Washington, General MacArthur, General Eisenhower, and Colonel Sylvanus Thayer, the father of the military academy, who overlooks the entire academy. So you can see just walking in the plain is like walking through the annals of American history. So I'd like to share a little bit about the genesis of Porcelain on Steel. This was born out of my experience as a high school volleyball coach in 2004. I had just come, and I just need to make one correction. I was an Olympic hopeful, and I competed in the Olympic trials. I was not successful in making the team. I finished 4th. The top 2 went, and USA number 2 won a gold in the debut of women's bobsled. But it's a pretty important distinction to make. There are few people who achieve and earn that, and I think it's only appropriate to make that distinction. But I had just come off of that, and I was in pretty damn good shape, to tell you the truth. But I took this job coaching young girls at our local high school, and so for preseason conditioning, I had put together this incredible regimen of sprinting and weight training and plyometrics and team building, and all these other incredible exercise. And my whole concept was that regardless of the skill of my athletes, we were going to be the most disciplined and best conditioned team in our league. In addition to preparing my team physically, I kind of had a little bit of a personal goal of getting back into shape after having given birth to my daughter, who was then 6 months at the time. She's now 9 years old. Well, several of my teenage girls showed up to practice that first day wearing tank tops with spaghetti strap bras, open skate shoes. Many of you may not even know what these things were. I certainly didn't. And a considerable amount of jewelry. And it wasn't what I expected in a mountain town obsessed with fitness and the mountain outdoor lifestyle. So within the first 15 minutes of that first practice, I issued 3 rules pretty quickly. It was kind of like a 3-round shotgun burst. The first was the 3 B's rule. And I'm sorry to disappoint you that it's not the be bold, be brief, be gone rule. It was the no breasts, butts, or bellies rule. They were not to be visible during training, practice, playing, or anything related to volleyball. The second one was athletic bras and shoes are to be worn and to be tied. I actually then spent the next 15 minutes of practice teaching my girls how to tie sneakers, because with the invention of Velcro and the proliferation of flip-flops, that art of tying shoes has died. And the third rule was push-ups, that we were going to do push-ups. And when I first dropped the girls for push-ups, one of them asked me, Coach McAleer, what kind of push-up are we going to do? And I kind of looked at her. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, what kind of push-up? And I said, we're going to do push-ups. As far as I knew from my time at West Point, there was only one type of push-up, and we all assumed the front-leaning rest position. And so for those of you who forgot what that looks like, this is a push-up. That my girls said, oh, you mean a man push-up? Well, I didn't know push-ups had a gender. So I will tell you, at the end of that first day, I was completely exhausted, way over my head, very concerned, but I was really inspired. Americans, I came to understand through my athletes, are bombarded with images of women selling everything from sexuality to self-centered materialism in everything product you can imagine, from beer to cars. Women are regularly objectified, sexualized, and misrepresented in the media. And so young women searching for role models have a really hard time going through all of that distortion. And they may have difficulty seeing past that sex sells mentality. And at the time, and you can do the math when we get there, I started this in 2004 was when I came up with the concept for this. At that time, nearly across the spectrum in media were images of publicity of people like Britney Spears, Paris Hilton, Lindsay Lohan. I even hate saying their names because I feel like I'm publicizing them. But this girls gone wild behavior where sexual allure was kind of enshrined in this Rosetta Stone of power, esteem, and confidence. And I was really concerned who my young athletes looked up to. And I began thinking about some of the women I went to school with at West Point, like State Representative Jeannie Reams, as I knew her, now Jeannie Imes, who is a classmate of mine from West Point, and some of the women I served with in the Army. And I thought, wow, these women are really role models. And if my girls could learn about some of them and some of the things they did, maybe they would think about some of the other options open to them. So I started doing some research, and I came across a psychologist named Penelope Lockwood. And her research concluded that women need role models more than men, and women benefit more than men from having those same gender models of success. And if you think about it, imagining one's own potential is very difficult for people who lack those role models. And for many young people of both genders, the journey to develop one's potential often begins with an understanding of what is possible. And I think meaningful role models, both in and out of military uniform, reveal possibilities. So this inspired me to share these stories of West Point women. The book spotlights 14 women who chose to make positive contributions to the military, their communities, and societies. And I personally believe their qualities of strength and character would lead to success in any area, but particularly today. They are rich, they are poor, they are athletic, they are geeky, they are studious, they're black, they're white, they're Hispanic, they're Asian, they're immigrant, they're native born, they're straight, they're lesbian, and they're a mosaic of American society. So I thought, okay, this book must have already been written. So I did a little research. Anybody want to guess how many books have been written about West Point, West Point's graduates? Anybody want to take a guess? Say again? I can't hear you. 500. 10,000. 10,000 different books have been written about West Point, the land, the graduates, the history. Yet, only 5 had been written about women at the time. Of those 4 individual stories, 3 are nonfiction, and 1 was a young adult novel. And the 5th is academic in nature, and it was the basis of Professor Lance Jander's dissertation. He is a military history professor at Cameron University in Oklahoma. And it was called Stronger Than Custom, the Admission of Women at West Point. And I will tell you, it's a tough book to read because about every other sentence is footnoted. So I want to back up before I get to West Point and talk a little bit about the history of women in the service. I think it's incredibly interesting that women have served in combat in all of America's wars. This is particularly interesting given that earlier this year, Secretary Panetta rescinded the combat exclusion policy. Women played a role in the American Revolution as nurses, laundresses, cooks, and under special circumstances, even artillery combatants. Such was the role of Margaret Corbin, a revolutionary heroine. Margaret Corbin, carrying pitchers of water to her husband John Corbin, a gunner's mate in the Pennsylvania Artillery, took his place at the cannon when he was killed in the crossfire of the British and Hessian troop attack on Fort Sumter in New York. Women have acted as spies, couriers, scouts, guides, nurses, and soldiers in both Confederate and Union armies. And some disguise themselves as men because regulations only provided for male enlistments. But it wasn't until 1942, with the looming threat of World War II and the anticipated manpower shortages, despite vehement opposition, that the bill establishing the Army Auxiliary Corps, WAC, was passed. That's the first bill of gender integration as we know it. The following year, President Roosevelt established the Corps as part of the regular Army, changing the name to Women's Army Corps with only one A, WAC. So in 1948, Congress passed the Women's Armed Services Integration Act that first allowed women to legally serve in our armed forces. I think you'll find some of these statistics interesting. Back then, the highest permanent rank a woman could attain was Lieutenant Colonel, 05. Women could not make up any more than 2% of the force, and while the act opened up the services, it imposed significant barriers on women in terms of gender and racial segregation, restrictions on dependent benefits, limited leadership opportunities, discharges for children in pregnancy, rank and grade ceilings, exclusion from ground combat. Specifically, just to give you a couple others, women were not permitted command authority over men. Concerns about women leading and commanding men, so a provision was included that the service secretaries could prescribe what military authority women could exercise, giving the services the ability to deal with the problem, women. The service women had to prove their husbands were dependent upon them to receive benefits. Service women were not afforded the benefits of married male service members until a 1973 Supreme Court ruling ruled it unconstitutional for a woman to require her civilian husband was dependent on her. It also permitted the discharge, as I said, of women becoming pregnant or who had children in their household for more than 30 days. It prohibited promotion to general officer and flag officer. So fast forward almost 19 years in 1967, the 2% cap on women is lifted and the restriction on women's promotions are lifted. And in 1973, our military becomes an all-volunteer force. So let's talk about that because that was really what was critical to the opening of the service academies. With the end of America's involvement in Vietnam and the impending elimination of the Selective Services Draft, military and civilian leadership faced the challenge of determining the composition of the armed forces going forward. The forces were devastated from war fighting, and women provided a new source of all volunteer recruits. Dr. Stephen Groves, West Point historian at the time, who I'm sure Paul knows, said, "The impetus for the admission of women to the military academy was related as much to the end of an unpopular war and the elimination of a draft as to efforts to provide equal opportunities for women. The place of an increasingly unpopular and frankly discriminatory draft would be an all-volunteer army. But who would sign up for an all-volunteer army?" In 1973, at a conference on the future of the Army, a captain in West Point Social Sciences Department, and a decorated and badly wounded Vietnam veteran, Captain Barry McCaffrey, made a presentation. And in that presentation, he suggested the expansion in the number of opportunities for women in the Army would be helpful. Senior Army officers told him since the conference papers were to be published, it would not help his career if the paper was included, so it wasn't. Well, it didn't seem to hurt Barry. He became America's youngest four-star general, became the drug czar in the Clinton administration. He also has a son and a daughter serving on active duty. The military leadership had to heed his words and found it had to expand opportunities for women from that 2% ceiling. Today, 1 in 7 soldiers in Iraq is a woman. So a dramatic change occurred in '75, 2 years after this conference. In the spring of that year, both Congress and the Senate passed legislation admitting women to the nation's service academies. Many military officers voiced vociferous objections to this new law. One of the most vocal was then Superintendent Major General Sidney Berry, a West Point graduate from the class of 1948. Berry staunchly argued that women had no place in the sacred institution whose mission, he believed, was to develop future combat leaders for the Army. Women were barred from direct combat duty and therefore should not be allowed to enter the military academy. Berry, along with other senior officers, reasoned that women are a threat to the cohesiveness, morale, and combat effectiveness of every unit in the Army, and therefore women should not be at West Point. Other high-ranking officials were equally as vocal. General William Westmoreland, a former superintendent of West Point and then active chief of staff of the Army, said, quote, "Maybe you could find one woman in 10,000 who can lead in combat, but she would be a freak, and the military academy is not being run for freaks." So in 1976, the service academies, under executive order by then President Gerald Ford, were open to women. At West Point, in Colorado Springs, and in Annapolis. Interestingly enough, the Merchant Marine Academy had been opened 2 years earlier in 1974. So now we move forward 65 years later. More than 2.5 million women have served in our nation's armed forces and have made history and broken barriers. I really believe history is our strength, and as most students know, but most of our politicians forget, we study history to avoid making the mistakes of the past and to create a different future. Today, there are more than 350,000 women in our armed forces. 15% of our active duty service members are women, 16% of our reserve soldiers, 20% of our new recruits, and 14% of our Operation Enduring Freedom and Iraqi freedom. And I think it's time we stop being surprised by America's daughters. So let me tell you a little bit about putting this book together. This book spans a range of classes from the class of 1980, which was the first class, as Paul mentioned, to graduate women. 119 women started on July 1st, 1976, and 4 years later, 62 graduated. So they had pretty much a 50% drop-off rate or a 50% graduation rate. It covers through 2007. It contains a mother and a daughter, and a wide range of experiences both inside and outside the Army, which I hope reflect kind of a spectrum of post-West Point life and history for all graduates. For me, each chapter in the book, I think, is really a forward to each graduate's own book, should she decide to write one. So a little bit about the publishing process and the writing process, and then I'll get into who some of these women are. So 4 years into the writing and research of this book, which I had thought I would be able to do in about 2.5, best-selling author John Grisham wrote me. I had been introduced to him by a friend, and he told me to prepare for lots of rejection. He said the first 15 agents and 16 publishers he approached said no to him. That first book of his was Time to Kill. 37 books later, he's had a pretty good track record. Unfortunately, I surpassed his high water mark for rejection and denial, and if you want to know the score, it's 28 agents and 22 publishers. But patience has never been my strength, and perseverance has, and all I knew was I needed one yes. And I think it's so ironic that that one yes came from a Navy veteran and Marine Lieutenant Colonel retired. I had shared this book with a good friend and classmate of mine in Jeannie's, Hess Sue Park. And I was teaching one day, and I get a call on my cell phone. She leaves me a message, and she said, "You found a damn publisher for that book of yours yet?" And I said, "No," and she goes, "I did today." And she goes, "You're going to get an email from me later." Well, Dennis Lowry, a Navy veteran, and Lieutenant Colonel retired Jim Zumwalt had founded a company called Fortis Publishing. And as many of you know, Fortis is Latin for strong, courageous, and resourceful. And Dennis and Jim were committed to ensuring the stories of West Point women were not written in invisible ink. And despite their water-based heritage, I think we make a pretty good joint team. So what I found out is writing is about discipline, attention to detail, simplicity, and facing the fear of being honest. See, in really good writing, less is more. It's true in speaking, I just haven't learned that yet. Thomas Jefferson said, "Never use two words when one will do." So this manuscript went through 19 versions. I'm often asked if I love writing. My answer is I love having written. Writing is a solitary act, but publishing isn't. It takes an entire team, and no book of this type is ever written by the author alone. Countless people put an incredibly inordinate amount of time to this, and I accrued many debts, especially to the hundreds of women who participated in this. So I'd like to share who are a few of these good women. These are just some overview shots of West Point, and we'll come back to the statue of Athena. I want to share with you, before I get into those, the significance of this picture. So I told you there was vociferous opposition from leadership of women coming to West Point, but there was so of the male cadets as well. This is a picture of the senior class in Company I-2 of 1979. This is the class that goes by LCWB. That's their acronym, Last Class with Balls. And just to emphasize that, you can see that the men in this company posed with various sports balls to memorialize and internalize that sentiment. This is the class of 1980. These are the 62 graduates from that class. This is actually in West Point history, an iconic photo, which was in Life magazine, which many of you may remember. So I will come back to this. Let me share first the story of Lieutenant Dawn Halfacker. She's class of 2001. This is a picture of Dawn. She was commissioned as a military police lieutenant, and she's getting ready to take her oath with then Colonel Martin Dempsey. Martin Dempsey is now General Martin Dempsey, the Chief of Staff, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Martin's daughter, Megan, and Dawn were both classmates and basketball teammates at West Point. As a combat military police platoon leader in Iraq, Dawn lost her right arm in an ambush. She questioned her ability to continue to serve her country, and yet the retired young captain found another way to secure and protect the force. She founded Halfacker and Associates, a growing $30 million company dedicated to providing national and homeland security services. This is Dawn after rehabilitation, dozens of hours of surgery, and intense therapy. She was one of our leading scorers and had ambitions and dreams of playing in the WNBA. This is Dawn upon getting her first prosthetic, which she found incredibly, unbearably heavy and quite useless. Next is Lillian Fluke. She's a retired major, class of 80. 3 years after surviving breast cancer, Lillian rode 6,000 kilometers cross-country with Lance Armstrong during the Tour of Hope to raise awareness for cancer. She then applied her physical prowess and entered the 2006 Masters World Bicycle Track Championships, where she smashed the world record on the velodrome. Recently, Lil founded the American War Memorials Overseas, a not-for-profit group dedicated to preserving, promoting, and documenting America's overseas history, wartime legacy of non-government war memorials. So we're probably all pretty familiar with the Battle Monuments Commission. Well, this organization focuses on all the small plaques and little gardens and monuments that many Europeans set up in their towns. She also happens to be the director of physical education at a high school in Paris, France, where she lives. And Lil's spouse, I believe, was a colleague with Paul, Peter Hurley. Then there's Lissa Young, class of 86, an Army aviator qualified on 3 different types of aircrafts. As the commander of a high-altitude search and rescue in Alaska, she was responsible for the tactical warfighting response force in the mountains and in the Arctic environments, as well as extracting mountain climbers off of North America's highest peak, Mount McKinley. After 16 years on active duty, selection for promotion to lieutenant colonel, and permanent assignment as a professor in the Department of Behavioral Sciences and Leadership, Lissa was asked to resign her commission because of then the military's don't ask, don't tell policy. She said her sexuality put her in violation of the Army's policy, and she had no recourse for appeal other than to launch a campaign against the policy, which she refused to do. I was 40 years old and had half my life been spent dedicated to serving the Army. I didn't want to spend the second half of my life fighting that Army. I also knew I did not want to be defined by this single moment. Lissa chose to embrace her dismissal as an opportunity to begin again. She just completed her doctorate at Harvard University, studying the history of science and how war has shaped the discipline of social psychology. She is currently under consideration to become a civilian professor at West Point, which ironically had always been her dream as a cadet. Next, there's Jackie Stewart. Jackie is on the far right in the second rank. Jackie's class of 90. She grew up in South Florida, the daughter of a Jamaican immigrant. At a very early age, Jackie's mother instilled on her the importance of education, and she was set on attending the best undergraduate college that would prepare her to become an architect. until she received that brochure from West Point. Jackie has a fundamental belief about the impact of service, and particularly as it relates to the education of children. Every child, not just those born into privilege or wealth, should have a role in defining the course of their nation and their world. Their words should be heard, and through advocates' involvement, we can help them amplify those voices. Today, Jackie is a social entrepreneur working with Lead America, a national youth organization. And lastly, this is Cynthia Lindenmeyer. Cynthia Lindenmeyer is a chaplain. In the book, on page 105, this is Cynthia's husband, Vince. Cynthia is officiating in this picture the wedding of Lieutenant Chris Gecky, class of 2008. On July 2nd, 2010, Cynthia received an email from Chris as they tried to figure out how to get together when he returned from his assignment in Afghanistan that August. Chris wrote, "I know you were hoping to use some of my time to dive into the ambitions that have been lingering in your mind for some time now." She's working on a book. "I cannot wait to watch the independent film written and directed by chaplain Cynthia Lindenmeyer. We'll talk soon, I'm sure." On July 13th, Lieutenant Gecky was killed in Kandahar City, Afghanistan, of wounds sustained when insurgents attacked his unit with a rifle, rocket-propelled grenade, and small arms fire. Chris is the third graduate whom Cynthia both married and buried. Lastly, I'd like to just share with you Heidi Brown, Major General Heidi Brown, class of '82. Ever since her Army career began in 1981, Brown has been breaking barriers. Her graduation and commissioning from West Point made her the first woman, the first combat arms and artillery officer from El Paso to graduate from West Point. She went on to become the first woman to command a Patriot missile battalion. As the commander of the 31st Air Defense Artillery Brigade, she was the first woman to command an air defense brigade and lead that brigade in combat in 2003 in the invasion of Afghanistan. Then on the other side of the war in 2009 and 10, she was equally challenged as she served as commander in charge responsible for withdrawing troops in Iraq. She oversaw the retrenchment of the nation's vast military enterprise and rising political tension ahead of that January election. She is the first woman to serve as Fort Bliss's chief of staff and the first female general officer in the branch of air defense artillery. Currently, Major General Brown is the director for Test and Missile Defense Agency and is responsible for all the programming, budgeting, staffing, and managing of the operations. I think it's important to note that a single chapter provides a mere glimpse into the life of a graduate. It's not her life story. There are two graduates whose stories are missing here. This is my ineptness with the technology. I'm not sure how to get to them. First Lieutenant Laura Walker, class of '03, was the first graduate killed in Afghanistan in 2005. Second Lieutenant Emily Perez, class of '05, was killed in Iraq in 2006. Their stories of service, courage, and sacrifice are missing from this collection. At the time of writing, their deaths were too painful and too recent and not included. I and many others look forward to sharing their stories. So between 1980 and 2012, 3,995 women have graduated West Point and served selflessly in the nation's armed forces. They are soldiers and wives, they are mothers and daughters, they are doctors and lawyers, clergy, teachers, and entrepreneurs. They are athletes, they are artists, they are cancer survivors and coachers. As I embarked on this journey, I had far more stories than I could possibly tell. I began a blog series called Honor Roll because most of these women, West Point and their experiences in the Army served as a launching pad that allowed them to make significant contributions. As most of you know, if you look back to World War II, nearly 6% of Americans served in uniform. The war effort was ever present, and in the remaining 94% of Americans were geared towards that war effort, whether it be rationing food, whether it be rationing gas or working in the factories. Today, less than 1% of our American population has served or is serving. And that decrease in military experience, I believe, has created to this chasm and this gap with the nation. Most of our country doesn't even know we are still a nation at war. So what was my point here? Who are all these soldiers? What are their stories? Well, we know of the many leaders and icons and sports stars and pop stars and celebrities. We know much less about those who served our nation, and my goal was to change that. As old graduates of West Point, we're all fond of saying the Corps has, and I really do believe the Corps has. It's gotten stronger, especially since women arrived, competed, and performed as cadets and in the faculty. The biographies of the women who shared their stories with me are a mere sample of the total. We have a recruiting poster at West Point that says, "Much of the history we teach was made by people we taught." West Point's women are making history, and while the women have changed the face of West Point, they have left untouched the ideals of duty, honor, and country, and service to our nation. So thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments. Yes, ma'am.
Right now, I'm about halfway through Brown's bio, and I'd like to know a little bit about what you went through. I mean, the two women from the class of '80 definitely had their hands full, based that no one wanted them there in '76. What was your life like compared to theirs, since you were a few years after they were?
Okay, thank you for that question. West Point is a difficult place for anyone, male or female. For me, it was an incredible challenge, particularly academically. I had played a lot of sports in college, so physically, while challenging, that was not where my particular challenges were. They were much more academic. But I will share, I was in a company whose mantra, our company was B1, so every company, at the time, we had 4 regiments, companies A through I, 1 through 4, and I was in a company called B1. Our moniker was Boys 1, and the men of that company made no bones about telling us their mission was to run every one of us out of that corps, out of that company plebe year. 5 of us started, 2 of us went on to the second year. 1 left under an honor investigation, 1 left on a medical dismissal, and another one just decided to resign. Jeannie and I started out with about 142 women. I think 110 of us graduated, so, you know, a much higher percentage. I found our classmates to be quite supportive. There were definitely challenges, and there were lots of innuendos, but overall, it was a very positive experience. It was an experience that certainly gave me a foundation and a bedrock of values that I go back to often. It's certainly something in almost everything I've ever done that people point to West Point, but it's not easy, and it's not easy for anyone there today. I actually think it's probably gotten a lot more challenging, both from a cultural perspective as well as an academic perspective. If you think of the proliferation of technology, I mean, you see me with 3 devices, right? Our cadets, every minute of every day is scheduled for them. Their ability to deal with various technology, with incredibly high demands, this is exactly what they're going to see when they get into the Army in a combat theater. So a lot of good times, a lot of bad times. I kind of choose to remember kind of the bonds you form. I mean, good steel is forged in hot fire. And what is West Point? It's a 4-year leadership crucible from day 1 till the day you graduate. And I think it's important to know that when you go in. So I hope that answers your question a little. Yes, sir.
They have to make this hybrid. Does the Army have to make an accommodation because of the difference in physical strength? You know, like the upper body strength of a guy that's worked out, he's strong. It's got to be stronger than a gal that's worked out.
Well, you got to remember, there's physical fitness standards, okay? And
Yeah.
so that measures one's level of physical fitness. And currently, those standards are based on physiological, gender, and age differences. As we go into the rescinding of the combat exclusion rule, as you can imagine, this has become a significant issue. Where the military is going to is keeping physical fitness standards, but developing gender-neutral, job-based standards. So if you're a gunner in a tank, right, it doesn't matter your size, but you have to have the strength in a very small space to pick up a 60-pound shell and load it. That is a job requirement. That shouldn't be based on gender. And that's what all the services are going through now in terms of their review, is developing job-related skill standards.
Been a study on how many have the lifespan of a military career for a female graduating West Point versus a male graduating West Point at the same time period?
Yes, there has been, and I will tell you, I don't have the numbers on those. In terms of how many, the 5-year, the 10-year, the career, yes, there has been, and I don't have the numbers on that.
Would you encourage your daughter to go to West Point?
It's a very interesting question that you ask right now, and I will tell you, if you want to read my entire article on that, you can look it up and I will give you the URL. Yes, I very much want my daughter to consider military service and to consider going to West Point. But we have a significant problem and a scourge right now in the military with the rates of sexual assault and sexual harassment. As Paul said, I serve on the Defense Advisory Council for Women in the Service. I think the military in West Point is an incredible learning environment, and it builds character and strength. It allows one to give back to their country, and I certainly want my daughter to become a productive citizen. But knowing what I know, and the military senior leadership right now acknowledging that there's a significant problem, acknowledging that they've failed to address the problem, and wanting to continue as we are today, I am very concerned. I individually believe, and this is Donna McAleer, that while the military was not set up as a social microcosm for change, it has often been a social microcosm for change. If you look back in the military history, the integration of African Americans, the integration of women, the integration of gay and lesbian service members, the significant reduction, almost near eradication of drugs, the reduction of DUIs, all those things have had a very positive impact on our civilian sector and our civilian society. And I really believe if the military decides to truly fight and address this, this is going to have a significant impact in our society. I mean, remember, our service members come from civil society. They serve in the military, and then they go back to Main Street. So, yes, I want my daughter to serve, but I want to see some changes. And I'm happy to give you that URL, because there's quite a bit of data in it, and it was exactly the question I wrestled with. It's very tough when you have a 9-year-old daughter, and she's read some of my writings, she hears me giving speeches. When your 9-year-old daughter asks you, what's rape? It's a pretty difficult question when you haven't even talked about sex yet, right? Yet, I want her and I want everybody else to go in eyes wide open. Unfortunately, there are bad apples in every organization. I mean, understand that these incidences, while the numbers are high, the numbers of predators are fairly small. The dilemma is the average predator commits over 300 acts in a lifetime. I mean, one is too many, let alone 300. So please, I don't want you to go away thinking that there's this high preponderance at West Point or in any one unit, but we do have some bad apples. And you have perpetrators that figure out a system and they continue to get around it. So there's a lot of, as you know, emphasis and work going on.
Talking about, addressing PTSD, and I guess the high number of suicides from the military. The differences between the male and the female. I know males like to internalize, they don't like to talk about problems. I guess, from what I understand, women like to work it out with other women. Are there differences between the male and the female as far as PTS and suicides and just dealing with the whole?
Sir, I really can't answer that question. It's not an area I've researched or studied about. I mean, I could tell you, as you know, the suicide rate's been incredibly high. I haven't looked at it by gender, and there is significant emphasis being placed on that and the availability of resources. I mean, if you think back, one of the things that was not thought through was a medical and strategy coming out of a war, and a high number of kind of the therapists, the support. You can't just bring on people with cognitive specialties and mental health professionals in a day. And so those rates have gotten significantly, we're seeing a lot more cases of that, and my understanding is that a lot more resources have been made available. But I can't answer the question because I don't know the data.
I was wondering, as you look across the spectrum of the various specialties or the corps that are available, the infantry, engineer, artillery, et cetera, are there any that are especially popular or, that draw more or fewer? And for that matter, are there any where there are still barriers?
Well, great question. So in terms of for women, prior to the change in the combat exclusion policy, and remember, that was just this year, what we were seeing at West Point was an increase of women going into the military police corps because for many, that was the closest they could get to infantry. It varies every year by class. There are requirements that come down from the Army in terms of how many officers that West Point needs to fill each branch, as well as the other commissioning sources. But I think one of the things that West Point is doing now that is so much better is, it used to be that your branch, what you chose, was purely based on class rank. You would put in an order sheet, in rank from 1 to 15. Okay, and it was typical as engineering majors who typically had a very high demand, very quantitative course load, had fewer grade point averages, and very few engineers were actually getting into the engineer corps. There is now a different way in which branches are selected. Class rank is part of that, but they go through a whole host of kind of a different battery of tests of where their interests are, where their skills are, what was their academic field of study, to better equip the Army with lieutenants in specific fields. So for example, signal. You would see a lot of electrical engineers going into signal and communications. So I think the process by which they're using is much more robust than just, class rank. There are also other branches have been opened up. It used to be that you could not, out of West Point, branch into the Adjutant General's Corps or the Finance Corps. You can now do that. The one branch, so infantry branch has now been opened. It will be, the services have till 2016 to come back to the Department of Defense if they want any, to prove any specialties should be closed because of gender. So up until the rescinding of this rule, infantry, armor, special forces were all closed to women. So, and the Marine Corps has a very interesting, I'll call it experiment going on. At the infantry basic class, they don't have gender-based standards. They have a physical standard. And there's been this fear that women are going to be flooding into the infantry. That's not the case at all. They've had 4 women that volunteered to go. 2 of them didn't make it through the first day. 1 made it through the first week. 1 made it through the second week. She had apparently significant stress fractures, and none of these women yet can go into the infantry, and they decided they did not want to risk a chance of losing their spot in aviation. So the military is continuing to work towards full integration. And why is that important? Because we've seen over and over again, from a readiness standpoint, a recruitment standpoint, as well as a senior command, it's combat commands that all lead to higher rates of promotion in those senior ranks. And that came out in a study by the Military Leadership Commission in 2011. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Were you?
Him? Oh, got a little confused there for a second. I've got a question pertaining to the statue of Athena. Is there any sort of significance of the statue of Athena to the women of West Point?
Yeah, very much so. Thank you, actually, for asking that question. So the cover of the book is a reverse of a relief statue by Lou Laurie, who was a sculptor. But Athena, as you know, is a Greek goddess. She was the goddess of war and wisdom, right? And her persona really combines the martial and the feminine. And it's very much a provocative mating of seemingly opposite but related attributes. In terms of the significance to West Point, she is part, as war goddess, known for strategy, cool courage, and military competence more than brute force. Her helmet is in our crest, and it's on almost everything at West Point there. And for me, why she was so significant is I think really the traits that she embodies are traits that represent many of the women who went there and those women who were there to integrate other women. Remember, we had some civilian faculty and some military faculty there, and I actually wrote an essay about Athena and her attributes that's in the back of the book. But I think kind of representing that fairness and that compassion, that strategic perspective and military competence is what makes Athena such a powerful symbol at West Point and why she is integrated into so many things.
And this will be our last question.
Thank you, Colonel. Have you looked at integration on the non-military side, such as the females entering VMI or the University of Notre Dame, who enter a male bastion and then have to incorporate themselves into that?
I'm not sure I understand your question. I mean, women...
Is the military experience different than a civilian experience going into an all-male academic program such as VMI or the University of Notre Dame?
I mean, I haven't talked to women at VMI or Notre Dame. I mean, if you recall, the service academy is integrated well in advance of VMI and the Citadel. So, thank you very much.
Hey, you bet. So that was a terrific talk and coverage of a wide range of issues. We're certainly delighted that Donna was here. And I think this is a textbook case of why we do these lectures. The issue of who serves is ultimately up to us. We decide as a society who serves. We always have, and it's always been controversial who has to go do that. And eventually, we the people, through our elected representatives, decide who will be our soldiers. We can all have a wide spectrum of opinion on whether it's appropriate or right, wrong, whether it's going to work or anything else, but once those people take the oath, they are our soldiers. And so we have as much of a responsibility in to serve them and support them as we do any other soldier, and we have the responsibility to insist that our chain of command from the commander-in-chief right on down to the lieutenant and the sergeant take care of our soldiers. This is a very profound responsibility, and it is part of why our Constitution says we the people are responsible for the common defense. So we appreciate very much your remarks tonight, Donna. Terrific, and we're a cheap date. No innuendo intended whatsoever. But we have for you this wonderful gift, environmentally correct water container, and you'll never lose it because yours is the big... There you are. Thank you so much. And Donna is going to go out right now with JD, because I know everybody would like to talk to her, but you can purchase a copy of her book at the stand in the lobby, and she will sign a copy of your book for you, and I hope you do that.
One picture, because my daughter never really believes I talk to people, so I got to take one picture of having an audience actually.
Here, you be in. I'll take the picture. Okay, now go stand out there. There, you in it. Look at that. I tell you what, if I get like this, these 52 people will look like 104. But you got 52 of the best. Thank you all for coming. Hope I see you on October 24th.